rhinos were killed last year, and 203 since the beginning of this year. In 20 years, rhinos are likely to be extinct, and so we challenge the opposition to show us how the status quo is possibly okay. Right now, we have three clashes. The first is the black market. The second is the safety and rights of rhinos. And lastly, we have this idea of regulation. So firstly, let's look at the idea of the black market, ladies and gentlemen. Because what the opposition have told us today is that regulation is extremely necessary. However, we see that regulation isn't necessary if the black market itself disappears. And we gave you many reasons why the black market will be diminished, because the demand for it will be undermined. We told you that people are going to realize that these aren't a good medical treatment, because now the information from people who bought rhino horn will be freely available. People won't have to hide it when they've used it. No thank you. Secondly, we told you that it's a status symbol because it's perceived as something which is basically unobtainable. This wasn't intended by them. And so we see that the black market will, instead of having a system which needs to be regulated, simply organically go out. Secondly is this idea of rhino safety, ladies and gentlemen. And basically, what Sam told you is that it's really bad for rhinos when they don't have their horns. Now, there's a couple of things we need to say to this. Firstly, we'd like to point out that this hinges on the idea that the black market will still exist and in fact be stronger. However, if the black market diminishes, it means that rhinos won't be attacked as often, and so they won't be dying because their horns are being hacked off by people who aren't experienced. No thank you, sir. Secondly, we see that for a rhino, when its horn is chopped off, it does grow back. And so we don't think that this is a long-lasting effect on that rhino. Lastly, no thank you, Dan. Lastly, we see that there are 48 tons of rhino horns in the Kruger Park. What that means is it won't really be necessary to cut the horns off, and because there's already a huge demand that we already have. And so we see that rhinos' rights aren't being undermined. More than that, we're showing you how in the status quo, rhinos aren't surviving, and so we need to change something in order to help them. We think it's much better to have experts carefully cutting off rhino horns instead of them being inexpertly done in a way that permanently harms them. Lastly is this idea of regulation. So we've already shown you how with the black market regulation isn't necessary. I'd like to add another layer to that, which is saying that the size and profit incentive of this black market means that it's very difficult to regulate constantly. However, if you have a legal market, you start to create a precedent which allows these companies to be monitored. We think that many companies are all very carefully monitored, and so this can be regulated. Sam simply didn't offer us enough analysis as to why that won't work. So now on to my positive matter. I have 2 points. The first is putting an end to the pseudo-war, and the second is the improvement of conservation movements. So firstly, putting an end to the pseudo-war. The conclusion to this point is that our policy would end the expensive and dangerous efforts to stop rhino poaching that's happening in game parks. We see that at the moment, the government perceives that a huge effort is necessary in order to stop this rhino poaching from occurring. What this means is that you have a strong military presence in game parks. Sometimes rhinos have up to 4 bodyguards. There are 2 problems with this. Firstly, it's hugely expensive. Millions of rands are going into protecting rhinos. Secondly, we see it's dangerous. 10 public servants are killed every year in poaching prevention, while only 50 police officers are. It's hugely disproportional, ladies and gentlemen. More than that, the situation is worse because it's simply not working. The fact is that rhinos are still being poached, even with all of these measures in place. And so we would like to end the pseudo-war. And our policy would do this in 2 ways. Firstly, it would the enemy from the situation. What this means is that the black market decreases, and so they won't be fighting this enemy all the time. Not only does the black market decrease, but the perception changes. Because instead of the view that it's the government versus poachers, it changes to a more moderate view about the best way to improve the situation. And so simply sending in lots of military will no longer be necessary. Secondly, we see that in the status quo, military is being used as a smokescreen because the government has put under a huge amount of pressure to be protecting rhinos. What that means is they want to appear as if they're doing something very constructive. However, taking other action will take that type of pressure off of them because it will appear like they're doing something. No thank you, Sam. My second point is the improvement of conservation. The conclusion to this point is that legalizing trade results in benefits for the conservation of all animals, not simply rhinos. This is strategically important because all their environmental reasons aren't just limited to rhinos. They're for all animals. And secondly, because we think that unless they prove that our policy will have a disastrous effect on the black market, and even if we don't win the black market point, benefits like the conservation of all animals will still stand, and so that would make us win this debate. So let's look at the three reasons why conservation improves. Firstly, money. Second, focus. And lastly, research. So firstly, money on conservation. Now, Josh already told you in his policy that a certain amount of profits from this system is going to go to conservation movements. We see that this is directly beneficial because for any conservation movement to be successful, they need a huge amount of finance. No thank you, sir. That money doesn't just go to the rhinos, but it goes to a whole group of animals. Secondly, focus. We see that at the moment, people aren't really buying into the rhino cause because it doesn't relate to them, and they're only affected very abstractly. In other words, they're only told that their grandparents won't see rhinos, which doesn't really affect them at the moment. However, attaching a value to the animal will make them see animals as not only commodities, but something that directly benefits the economy. We'd like people to buy into this because we think they're more likely to donate money to these causes and put pressure on the government and force the government to focus on them as well. Lastly is this idea of research, ladies and gentlemen. This is important because we would like new mechanisms in which to conserve animals. More and more technology is coming out every year which already is improving this. For example, DNA tracking. For example, in vitro fertilization of endangered animals. We think it's important that even when the population of an animal is diminished, it still doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to go extinct. In the status quo, the government struggles to do this because of funds. However, this will give corporations a financial incentive to provide this type of research. And so we see, ladies and gentlemen, to end the pseudo-war, to stop rhinos being killed, the motion must stand.